This is the video for the readings on the book of Numbers and the very last part of Deuteronomy. We are reading through the story of the Bible, and so we come now to the book of Numbers, and this has some wonderful things in it for us. The book of Numbers is about the children of Israel's journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land, and we discover that that journey is not going to be smooth, partly because they will wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So why is the book of Numbers important? It's one of those that we might easily skip over in our reading of the Bible. But we see a number of important things about God's relationship with his people in this book. We learn about the providence of God in some difficult times. And we learn about trusting God when we're in a wilderness situation. And sometimes we find ourselves in the wilderness as well. So it turns out to be a very, very useful and important book. So let's review some of the concepts in Numbers and the end of Deuteronomy. So remember in the book of Exodus that the people received the law, they built the tabernacle, that's the book of Exodus and Leviticus. And so in this book we learn a number of things about the story of their life with God. We learn about the cloud that guided them both by day and by night. And one of the interesting things was when the cloud moved, well, the people got up, they packed up all their possessions, and they moved as well. And they might go several weeks before they settled. They might actually just go for a day. And so this was kind of the reminder to them, well, not to get too comfortable. Always be open, be aware that God may call you to someplace different. And so when the cloud moved, the people moved as well. We see in the story how God's provision for them took place. He feeds them with manna and with quail in the wilderness. And it's a reminder of God's provision for us. Jesus would say, look at the birds of the air and see how your Father feeds them, and you are of more value than they are. So don't be anxious. God will take care of you. And we see that God takes care of the Israelites in the wilderness. Well, we see a lot of times in which the people complain about not having enough food, about not having water to drink, about leadership and all sorts of things. And so these stories really serve as a warning to us not to complain and grumble to God and about God when all sorts of things don't go exactly the way we want them to go. It may be that God is testing us and building our faith in the process of some of our difficulties. We also have the story about God, the people's failure to trust God to bring them into the promised land, which was a land flowing with milk and honey, as God had said, but also had lots of people populating it. And the people had a moment of lack of faith, and God was angry with them and sent them back into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. It's a very, very tough lesson for them to learn, but a reminder to us that sometimes we have to trust God for things that may seem very challenging for us. We learn in this section about the bronze serpent that Moses made and lifted up, and when the people looked at it, they were healed from their snake bites. And this is important because Jesus is going to refer to this incident in John chapter 3, and he's going to say, like the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Well, we also learn in this section about Moses' sin, for which God would not allow him to enter into the promised land, and that's very important, an interesting story. We see that they defeat several nations when they get to the edge of the promised land under the leadership of Moses. And we also have in this section the very interesting story about the prophet Balaam and his donkey speaks to him and rebukes him. And this is seen in the New Testament as a story of a prophet who was greedy for material gain and who in the end would suffer for it. We also see in this section that Joshua is appointed the successor of Moses. And so at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we have the death of Moses. And we've skipped over much of Deuteronomy because it's not part of the story, but it's a very, very interesting and wonderful book, and it's 3 sermons by Moses at the last recounting what God had done for the people. So in this section, we see the end of the story of the life of Moses. And in the end, Moses is simply called the servant of the Lord. And that's a wonderful description of Moses, because instead of enjoying what would have probably been a very successful and luxurious life in the land of Egypt, he chose to follow God, and to follow God wherever that would lead. We see in the end that Moses appoints Joshua to be his successor, and then when God calls him and tells him to go up on the mountain, for it's time for him to die, Moses does so obediently, and it says that the place of his burial at the time of the book's writing was not known by anyone. So he dies, and his story ends very humbly as the servant of God. But we get to see the end of the story of Moses and this wonderful prophet and servant of God. So at the end of the book, we have the people ready to enter the promised land. Joshua is appointed to be the successor and the one who will lead them in. And we'll pick up with that later, but for now, we have this wonderful set of stories in the book of Numbers, and then at the very end of Deuteronomy, we see the death of Moses himself. So enjoy your reading, and we will see you when you're done.